Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today. Now, I realise that we've been in this room for several hours already, and we've also just had lunch. And so I do imagine that the ability to focus might be waning a bit. So.
Don't snore. Just snore. We're close to the
I had this in mind when I was putting this presentation together. So what I have tried to do is make an interactive presentation in the hope that if nothing else, at least it'll keep you awake for the next half an hour or so. So I'm going to talk about clinical research and publication ethics. But before I start, I'd like an idea of how many people in the room have had experience of or currently handle medical manuscripts and medical research. Okay, so that's great. So I hope that a lot of what I say will relate to you and we'll be able to have some more of an interactive session. Okay. I don't think any talk on clinical research ethics is complete without reference to this particular study. It's a famous study, the Tuskegee Syphilis study, which ran for 40 years. And the aim of this study was to monitor the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The study was carried out in a group of African American men, and they were not told that they were taking part in a study. And when treatment for the syphilis became available in the early 1940s, these participants in this study were not treated. And so the syphilis was allowed to progress. Now, you may not be aware, but actually tertiary syphilis is a truly awful disease. It eats away at all sorts of parts of your body. And if it hadn't been an after-lunch session, I would have put up some photographs to show you just how awful it is. So it is quite astonishing that anybody imagined that it would be all right to do this study. And you may think, well, this was a long time ago, and perhaps people were not thinking about research, clinical research ethics, and it was a thing that was done at the time. But in 1947, people were thinking about the proper way to conduct clinical research. The Nuremberg Code had already been agreed on by 1947, and this was the result of clinical research that had been carried out during the war and the subsequent Nuremberg trials that had been carried out. And this Nuremberg Code has 10 points that define legitimate ethical clinical research. And it is an important document, and it's still referred to today. And here's just one example about where this code is cited and used. Another really important document is the Declaration of Helsinki. Now, this took the Nuremberg Code, the 10 principles in the Nuremberg Code, and combined it with the Hippocratic Oath, the principles of the Hippocratic Oath, and created guidelines. And this was done by the Medical Association, the World Medical Association, and it was intended for doctors who conduct research. So with this in mind, that syphilis study seems even more awful, because while that study was running, other people were forming guidelines and agreeing on the correct and proper way to conduct clinical research. These two documents are not the only documents. There have been many more since then, but these, I think, are the key ones, and they have informed guidelines and legislation ever since. So, for example, this is a European directive that aims to harmonize how clinical research is carried out in Europe. And here is just an example of one of the many acts of Parliament in the UK to regulate clinical research. And one of the important parts of this regulation is that clinical research should undergo some kind of review by an independent body, an ethics committee. And here again, this is just an example that any research carried out in the National Health Service on National Health Service patients must undergo a review by an ethics committee. So what has this all got to do with us as publishers? So here is a snippet from the Code of Conduct for Journal Publishers. And this says that publishers should work with journals to ensure that their policies address many issues, including research ethics related to clinical research. So if you're running a medical journal or you're publishing a medical journal, you may think, okay, so we have very clear guidelines and we have advice on the type of policies we should have, and my journal has all of these policies. So I'm actually doing all the right stuff, and as long as I don't publish anything that doesn't comply with my policies, I'm fine, I'm okay, and that's the extent of my responsibility. But it isn't as simple as that. I think despite all of these guidelines, and despite a journal editor or a publisher having clear policies, managing research on managing clinical research is very, very challenging. And I hope that we can discuss some of those challenges during the course of this talk. So what are the challenges? Well, it's all very well having lots of guidelines, but if these guidelines and expectations are not shared throughout the world, obviously this is a problem. And so this is going to bring me to my first example or first case. I just want to declare here that I have amended and tweaked these cases just to make them easier to present and talk about. The principles behind them are based on real life factual cases. So this is one that cropped up perhaps about 5 years ago, and this was a study, and it was written up and submitted, and the authors institution in country A approved a protocol, and a group of researchers wanted to test the effectiveness of a homeopathic treatment on the quality of life of patients who were HIV positive. So these authors did apply for approval from an ethics committee, and the ethics committee approved it. And what's really surprising is that the ethics committee approved that the study should be carried out in a different country. So the authors then travelled to this other country and carried out the study in a local population there. Now, there's standard treatment for HIV, and it was available in this second country, but these patients, none of the patients were offered this treatment. It was not made available to them, even though the treatment was available in that country. And the way that consent was obtained was by putting all of these people in a lecture room and giving them a lecture about the study and asking them if they wanted to take part. So, to my mind, this was 4 or 5 years ago, but this is just as awful as the study I showed you right at the beginning. This is a vulnerable group of people with an awful life-threatening disease who have not received the treatment that's available for them. And this has been approved by, even worse, but this has been approved by an ethics committee, which is supposed to be complying with all of these guidelines that have been established since the first awful research that was carried out during the war. So this lands on your desk, or one of your editor's desk. I'm going to pause there and ask you, what should the editor do? So we know that, have they complied with your journal policies, assuming that your journal policies are all up to date and proper?
Hypothetically, they complied. But I'm not publishing that.
Okay, so I think we're all agreed we're not going to publish this. We're not going to send it to peer review. But what can you do? What can you do as an editor, or a publisher even?
You have to go back to the people who wrote the paper. That's the first step. That's to make them do it.
Absolutely. Any other ideas? So we're certainly going to go back to these researchers and challenge them.
Why wouldn't you just report it to the ethics board instead?
Yeah.
There makes no sense.
Yeah.
But the ethics board gave approval in the first place. You challenge their decision. If they've given permission for this work, they've got some interesting views.
I mean, the person submitted to you, I think you have to go back to them in the first place.
Yeah.
Your relationship is between, well, your editor, let's say, or you, it doesn't make much difference.
Absolutely. So I think,
Can you repeat what actually said? I don't think we've
I'm terribly sorry, I feel sorry. I was saying that the relationship between the journal and the individual person submitting, and that therefore it would be inappropriate to go outside until you've actually consulted them. That's my feeling.
Okay, I think you're all on the right path. So what can the editor do? Well, the very first thing to say is that the editor should certainly not reject this submission. It's not okay to say, oh, this doesn't comply with my policies, and therefore I'm just going to reject it. The editor is obliged to follow this through because it is so unethical and awful. But bear in mind that you haven't got, all you have is this manuscript and you've made a judgment of it. You do need to go back to the authors and query it. But you want to pursue this as much as possible, as far as you possibly can. You need to follow this up. So the first thing is you go to the editors. And I use the term ask the editors for an explanation, and I think we referred to this earlier this morning, is that all of your communication should be very neutral and not make any accusations, but you're seeking information, you're trying to find the evidence to find out what is going on, so that then you can express a concern or ask for an investigation. So all your communication should be very measured, even if you do feel very angry about the study and what's been done in the study. So first thing is to go to the authors and ask for an explanation. But you should keep on pursuing it if the authors don't come back to you and give you an explanation. So yes, you should ask the ethics committee in as neutral a way as possible how they came to approve this study. And did they have any concerns about the fact that it was conducted in a different study? Other options you could do is you could ask the funders, if you know who the funders are. Are they aware that they are funding research like this? You could go right to the top and ask the Department of Health of the country where the study was approved and where the study was carried out. And you could even go to the regulatory organisations of the doctors involved. So my point here is that you should pursue it. That's the point I'm trying to make. Go as far as you possibly can to question what has happened, even if you don't have the power to change it. And this is exactly what happened in this case, in that the editor did go to all these people and flag that this was happening, flag that it was of concern, flag why, could somebody please throw some light on why it was allowed to continue. Now, this is going to take me on to my next challenge, but at the end of the day, with this particular case, the editor didn't get any responses from any of these organisations, so that it wasn't actually properly resolved, and it's unknown whether these researchers were ever held accountable, or the ethics committee for that matter were ever held accountable for this particular study. And as I said, because of this, another challenge for clinical editors is that you can feel very powerless, because as a journal editor or a publisher, you get the research after it's all been done and dusted, and you think, well, what possible, what influence or power can you have to change things? So here's another example to perhaps maybe address that. Here, this time you receive a manuscript, and it's a protocol for a randomized trial. And the authors have done everything correctly. So they went to their ethics committee, which approved the study. They have got, all the consent and approvals that they need have been all properly done. And they've written a protocol, and they want to publish the protocol before they start the study. Unfortunately for the potential participants, when they submit this protocol, new evidence comes to light about the potential harm that this intervention can do to people who have a history of heart disease. And so it is possible that the people who take part in this randomized controlled trial may be harmed by the intervention that is going to be given to them in this randomized controlled trial. But again, these authors have complied with your policies up to now. They've ticked all your boxes. So what can you do in this case? So the authors were asked about this, and they came back and said, but it's all been approved. We have done everything. We've approved everything. We comply with your policies. Yeah. That's right. So what can the other two? Well, points to consider. The study has not yet begun, so you have the power to change it because people haven't been recruited for this study yet. You know, if it's allowed to continue, that participants will be put at risk. So again, you don't reject it because the authors could go elsewhere, publish it elsewhere, or the author could try not to publish the protocol at all and just get on with the study very quietly without letting anyone know, in the hope that the study, once it's done, it's done. And so as an editor, you have to do something because somebody might actually be put at risk if you don't do something about this protocol. And yes, in light of the new evidence that this intervention could be harmful, the editor did ask the authors. The authors came back and said, oh, we've done everything correctly. And the editor insisted that the authors go back and talk to the ethics committee again in light of the new evidence and show them the new evidence. And then the ethics committee agreed, yes, there is a problem with this protocol. That protocol has to change. And the ethics committee insisted that the protocol was changed to make sure that at-risk people were not recruited into that study. And eventually it was fine. The authors changed the protocol and the journal did eventually publish the revised protocol. So I think this is a really nice story because this does illustrate that although you might feel helpless, sometimes you do have the power to change things. And I think in this case, the editor probably saved somebody, some actual real human being, from coming to harm by taking action on this case. Okay. And then the other challenge is that there are sometimes scenarios that are not covered by the guidelines at all. And here's another example. Here, a group of researchers published a study about a possible role of an infective agent on the development of a childhood ailment. And this infective agent is in a public place. The study was published about 17 years ago, and no one has done any research on a similar line since the study. But the editor was alerted that the authors had not obtained ethics approval at the time of the study, although their institution did have an ethics committee at the time. And the authors say in the manuscript that their study did not need ethics approval. So I'll pause there and say, any thoughts on that one? What is the issue here? It's a published article. Why can't you ignore it? Because they really didn't think they needed it. Because it wasn't an interventional study. So the participants hadn't been given any particular kind of treatment. It was more of a survey and a blood test. So it was very minimum intervention. The authors had actually conducted the study very carefully and correctly and had obtained consent, and there were no concerns about the conduct of the study. They'd done that properly. There was no concerns about the science. The study had been conducted in a proper way. The conclusions were all fine. Just to add, the authors now had a funder agree to fund further research on this in this area as well. So what are the issues here? I mean, if you look at it very simplistically, you could say, well, they didn't obtain ethics approval. My policy says they should have done. There was an ethics committee there at the time. Therefore, I should retract this article. So does anybody who would agree with that course of action and that reasoning? So I can see some people shaking their heads there. So why are you shaking your head? Why would you not retract the article?
My feeling is that once it's published, it's out there. You can't undo it. You can potentially put a strain of concern from the publisher on the existing one.
Can you all hear Tom? Yeah.
You repeat.
Yeah, so Tom's saying that it's published, it's already out there, it's been out there for 17 years, so you could put an expression of concern on the article saying that you are concerned that this didn't receive ethics approval. So would you not retract any unethical study? Do you think any study that you feel is either unethical or hasn't complied with your policies should be retracted or shouldn't be retracted.
Policies evolve over time. We would never stop retracting if every time our policies change, we went back through the literature and retracted everything we didn't comply with the new one.
Yeah, so that's a key point. This was 17 years ago. So, sorry, Natasha was saying that policies change over time. So if we retracted everything that didn't comply with our policies just because our policies had changed, we'd never stop retracting. Sorry, was there a comment from over there?
Yeah, so just being, I don't know if this is ethical or not, but I retracted A because it draws a bright ethical line about you had an opportunity to go through your ethics committee and you did not. That's probably not good. And then it will be cited
Because it's,
because it was retracted.
I see.
It will get attention again, so as an editor, I want to have more citations.
okay.
Is that science policy?
Just being cynical.
Some more information.
Sure.
You're just, the editor is alerted that authors did not obtain it. What do the authors
So-
say? They did go to the ethics committee and the ethics committee said
Yes. So I think exactly. So whenever there's anything like this that's raised, the first step is always to go to the authors and ask for an explanation of what's going on. Now the authors were genuinely quite distressed by this. They said that they didn't realise at the time that for their kind of study they needed to go and get formal ethics committee approval because it was just a very simple survey study, and they just said they genuinely didn't realise that they needed to go and get ethics committee. They thought it was okay to go ahead with it without approval. And that's when they told the editor, oh, and we've also got funding. We've got funding for more research now to pursue this line of inquiry. And please don't retract the article because we'll lose our funding. We won't be able to carry on with our research in this area. Sorry.
I think I would say that obviously look into it as far as you can, but if you feel if they've complied with the spirit of the ethical policies, even if it's not to the very letter, if you looked at the very letter and, some of those would have got through some of the previous cases, even though they were clearly unethical. So I do think it's important to bring judgment to it, really.
Yep, absolutely. So, did somebody else have a comment? Hi.
Could they apply for retrospective approval? I don't know if that's possible.
I think a lot of people think that a retrospective approval is a bit of a waste of time. So just going through the motion of applying for approval retrospectively is once the study is done, is a pointless exercise. But I think you're on the right track. So in this case, the editor felt that because this research was done with respect for the participants, there were no concerns about how the study was conducted. It was scientifically sound. It was, the authors had a believable reason. This was 17 years ago, and they probably behaved in the same way that many of their peers would have behaved at the same time. They just didn't know. They were poorly informed. And somebody was interested in the potential of this research enough to want to give more money for that research to continue. So because of those factors, the editor wanted to give the authors the benefit of the doubt and not retract. What the editor did was the editor went back and asked the ethics committee, told the ethics committee that this had happened, and didn't say, oh, give us retrospective approval, just asked for their opinion. And the ethics committee was very unconcerned about it and said, we have no concerns about this. We honestly, if they had submitted it at the time, we would have approved it anyway. So yes, that's what the editor did. I'll carry on and just show you. So what can the editor do? That's just summarising what I've just said. So in light of everything, and also because if the article is retracted, the funding could be withdrawn. And so in a way, this could actually block a line of inquiry, a line of scientific inquiry, if the funder suddenly dropped out because the article was retracted. The editor made the very difficult decision, and that's the point that you were making, that sometimes you have to rise above your policies and make a judgment call based on bigger issues and wider issues. So the editor decided that they would leave the article published and they wouldn't retract it, but they would publish an erratum explaining the false, well, not false, but the inaccurate statement in the manuscript about ethics approval, and then also explaining their decision for not retracting it in spite of this. So the point about this particular example is just to illustrate that it is not just about ticking boxes, it's not just about complying with policies. Actually, a lot of these cases require a lot of thought and a lot of consideration of much wider, bigger issues, as in this case where the editor had to consider the wider public health issue, the potential consequences of blocking that line of research as well. And it may be that this is an important line of inquiry which might perhaps sometime in the future inform some kind of treatment for this childhood ailment. Okay. So what are the new challenges? So up till now, we've had sort of ethics committee approval, and part of that approval needs local ethics committee consent, and there needs to be consent for the participants to take part in the study, and it has to be informed consent. Now, here you might remember this, which was in 2014, where some researchers did some study on the internet via Facebook and manipulated the feeds that people using Facebook were getting in order to see whether it altered their mood. But they didn't have, there was a whole uproar about it because the participants didn't know that that's what was happening to them. So this is very sort of one that reached the headlines. But again, this is becoming an increasingly widespread problem. And I've seen submissions of research where YouTube videos of children have been used, and the researchers have sort of tried to diagnose autism, things like autism, from videos off the internet. How acceptable is that? There's no guidance for that, because this puts the whole issue of local ethics committee approval out the window. How can you have local ethics committee approval when your research involves the whole world who uses the internet? And similarly, how can you have informed consent? How do you get informed consent for all of these people? These are new challenges. A colleague and I tried to get some clarity on this, and we contacted all the ethics committees in the UK to ask what their policies were. And two got back to us admitting that they didn't have any, so they didn't know. So there's nothing at the moment. So this is a new line where hopefully should be, hopefully in the future, some new guidance on how to conduct these kinds of studies. Okay.
Say that internet-mediated research is a really big issue. The ethics committees aren't up to date. But the British Psychological Association does have some guidelines on this, because even with normal projects done online, identity, approval, deception, they all have very, very different implications. So they have some really smart guidelines that we've developed.
Yeah. So hopefully these will become merged in some way, and perhaps there'll be a sort of amendment to the Declaration of Helsinki or something like that needs to happen to provide guidance for everybody. So in conclusion, I think what do we need to do? Well, I think we all need to acknowledge our collective responsibility when it comes to clinical research, because every piece of clinical research that's published can be traced back to a real human being at the end of it who has volunteered for that research for the greater good, and we sort of need to feel the burden of that responsibility to make sure that they were treated correctly when they volunteered. And also to bear in mind that not all research that ticks your policy boxes is ethical, and not all research that does not tick your policy boxes is unethical. It actually needs quite a lot of thought when things don't seem quite right. And how can publishers support editors? Well, I think there needs to be more awareness. And I know lots of academic editors that I work with really don't know all of this, are really shockingly unaware. And so we need to really work hard to make sure that we provide lots of resources and training to make sure that our editors know what it is that they should be doing. And we should help editors pursue issues to the farthest possible extent, even if you feel you can't do any, it's not going to make any difference in the end. I think if we all pursued all issues to the farthest possible extent, we would have the power to change things. And be brave and retract on all unethical research if you think it is truly unethical and unuseful. I think that's it. That's all I had to say.